I'm going to share the screen. Sorry, I got caught up talking to everybody about the pickleball.
It's riveting, you know?
All right. Does that look okay on your end?
Yeah, looks good.
Awesome. All right, we can give everybody a couple more seconds to log on for tonight's webinar. We'll start shortly. Our webinar tonight is titled Launching Strong, Essential Tips for Starting Your Second Year of Medical School. We'll get started in a second. If I can make this look different. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started so we finish on time, I guess. And this is still looking good on your end, Christina, right?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, perfect. Like I said, the webinar tonight is titled Launching Strong, Essential Tips for Starting Your Second Year of Medical School. We'll just start with some brief introduction. So my name is Emily Zielinski. I am currently a spine surgery fellow at the Cleveland Clinic. And I previously completed my orthopedic surgery. I guess I need to update my bio. My orthopedic surgery residency at Indiana University. And I have been a tutor with Elite Medical Prep since I believe like February of 2019. So going on 5 years now. And I'm really excited to be here with you guys tonight. Christina?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey guys, I'm Christina. I'm a fourth year neurology resident at Penn. I've been with EMP since 2022, so a little bit newer, but had a blast and really excited to chat with you guys and answer your questions about, your time in medical school.
Awesome. All right. So just a brief overview of what we want to cover with you guys tonight. And then please, I just want to encourage you to either drop questions in the Q&A throughout the session. We'll leave time at the end to answer any questions you have, so you can write them in the chat or use the Q&A box. Please, any and all questions that you guys have, that's why we're here. We're just here for you tonight and help you be as successful as possible. So briefly kind of discuss the challenges and opportunities that present in the second year of medical school. We're going to spend some time emphasizing the importance of building good habits early to set you up for success, because unfortunately, the exams do not end with USMLE. I just finished my board exam in July, so you still have to keep taking exams, and getting good study habits in early will really help you throughout the rest of your medical career for sure. And then we'll also review some proactive strategies to help you achieve success throughout the year. So I think the first thing to note about transitioning from first to second year of medical school, which some of you may be kind of experiencing already, is like, one, I think it's important to reflect on how your first year of medical school went. Some people take a non-traditional path to med school, right? Some of you might be coming back into med school or back into like education from a career, or just different than undergrad. There's a whole like breadth of material that you have to memorize and work through. So, just spend a couple minutes thinking about, what worked well for you. Did you feel like you were studying in a productive way? Did you feel like you were constantly behind? What was going well? And what could have gone better? Because I think that can really help you to make a good plan for this year to build on throughout your medical school experience. And then, identify growth areas. Like, if there's content that you feel like, I just like really didn't get a good grasp on that. Try to be proactive about that starting out early in the second year, so that you're not playing catch up, because by the time that you get ready to sit for USMLE step 1 and you're getting ready for your dedicated exam or dedicated study period, if you're going to be taking step 1 at the end of your second year, you don't really want to be scrambling and like, oh my gosh, I need to like completely relearn like all of the pathways in the brain and the spinal cord. And I'm just using that reference because I'm a spine surgeon. Christina's in neurology, because that is a lot of material to try to rework through and relearn in a short period of time. So be proactive. Note, if you're struggling in certain areas, then take this time now to try to buff those subjects up and, have a plan going forward for the rest of the year so that you can be as successful as possible. The other thing about second year that's different is that you're really shifting your focus in most institutions from being like preclinical, very basic science, like still talking about the Krebs cycle at times, to moving into more of the advanced preclinical, like pathophysiology, a lot of cardiopulmonary and renal systems that can be very challenging to learn. And so some of that, and it all ties together. So the tricky thing about second year is I think that, once you start getting into your systems-based learning, a lot of times it's very easy. If you don't have a good grasp on one system, it all sort of builds on each other. And so you really need to have good habits early on so that you can solidify your understanding, of the cardiovascular system before you start adding in the respiratory and the renal and things like that. There's also increased complexity for that reason. And then the other thing that's unique about second year, I think, is you can plan for some clinical exposure, and you can start thinking about doing, I think one thing that's underutilized is shadowing. If you have time during second year to do some shadowing potentially, and, spend some time looking at different specialties before you get into your clinical rotations, just because your clinical rotations during third year, those tend to come on kind of quick, and you only have a set amount of time to see kind of a set number of specialties. And so if there's anything you're interested in that's kind of outside of the scope of I don't know, your core competency clerkships, if you're interested in interventional radiology, for example, or neurosurgery, sometimes you don't have the opportunity to see those specialties on your core rotations. And so trying to talk to some of your physicians and teachers who are coming in to give your lectures during your second year, you might be able to find a shadowing opportunity or two to just kind of get an idea of what you might be interested in going into. And then, I think the other thing that's tricky about second year is that with the advent of USMLE Step 1 being pass fail, we tend to put a lot more pressure on students to do research and get involved in extracurriculars earlier, because those are the things that can differentiate you. And so if you haven't gotten involved in research yet, it might be something that's on your priority list to try to find a research project or two to get involved with this year, while you're also balancing all of your coursework, the looming presence of USMLE Step 1, et cetera. So the biggest thing to start with for this year, I think, and start early, is to figure out how to set really realistic goals so you don't get bogged down in kind of the thick of everything that you feel like you have to do. And so one tool that we kind of talk about is setting SMART goals. And so SMART goals, SMART is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals. So, having an abstract goal of I just want to do well on my cardiovascular exam. Okay, your cards exam, what does doing well mean? What's your specific goal? So you want to prioritize your goals in terms of short-term goals. So for your individual clerkship or individual exams for your school. And then you also want to think about long-term goals, and you can divide these in terms of how many questions you're going to do. If you're starting your question, we'll kind of get into, question-based learning and things like that now and studying, but you can set it into things like, how many questions am I going to do? And then, what is the overarching big picture goal of how I want to do this year and what I want to accomplish? And then identify some top priorities. I think you don't want to put too much on your plate at once, because it's very easy to get overwhelmed. And so identify your top priorities. If it's I want to do well on this one exam, I want to score 80% on this first exam, and I want to, find one mentor this first block that I can talk to in whatever specialty you're interested in. And then I want to shadow one time, something that's very measurable and specific, so that you're not setting 10 different goals at once that you can never really achieve because they're kind of vague. And you want to try to balance competing demands. So, like we've talked about, research, exams, those are things that are going to be coming at you, extracurriculars. You're going to be getting pulled in a lot of different directions. And I think it's really important, I'm sure Christina would echo this, to make sure that you're balancing your schedule with the other things that are equally important for your well-being and overall mental health. So, making sure that you're allowing yourself enough time to get good rest every night. Make sure that if you're somebody who enjoys working out, or we were talking about golf and pickleball before we started the webinar, there's activities like that you enjoy doing. don't give up your hobbies. Don't completely get like axed from your intramural league. Make sure you build that into your schedule so that you can have time for those important things that help to keep you kind of grounded throughout the year. And then track your progress like regularly with each block, reassess how am I doing with these goals, what's working, what's not, to keep you on track. So as far as creating an effective study schedule, I think there's a couple different ways you can go about this, depending on how detailed you want to be. So I think for some students, if you just have a set list of kind of, these are my 6 to-do list items for the day, I'm going to write them out. I'm going to go to my class. After my class, I'm going to spend time watching Boards and Beyond video to supplement. Then I'm going to do some questions, et cetera. You can have kind of a bulleted list of the things that you want to get done in the day. And then you can also break that out into the larger like week at hand. So if there's a practice exam or something you want to take for an upcoming block exam or something like that, then you can build that into your schedule. Sometimes if you're a really detail oriented person and you want it down to the hour, which admittedly I was a little bit neurotic myself when I was in your shoes. So I used a calendar app and I would plan like, okay, for this first 2 hours, I'm going to do X. And then for the next like 2 hours, I'm going to do Y. So you can kind of get very granular with it if you need to see how time-wise everything's going to work out or fit into your schedule. You just have to be careful that a lot of times I think we all have a tendency, or at least I do, have a tendency to underestimate how long it's going to take me to do something. And so always make sure in your schedule that you're building in time in case you get behind or in case like something in life comes up and you weren't able to complete all of your tasks as you originally planned. That way you have a buffer period and you're not stressed about like, oh, I'm like super behind already and it's only been 2 days. At least you have time to get caught up. From a daily routine perspective, I think having structured blocks of study time and like having a plan for what you're going to do in those blocks. So structured blocks can mean like, I'm going to do 20 questions in the afternoon and I'm going to make sure that I do that in this like 2-hour period. And then you can use the Pomodoro technique, if any of you are familiar, and that essentially is a technique to help keep you balanced, but allow time for a break. So you're kind of resting your mind every 30 minutes. So you focus for 25 minutes on a task and you work until the timer goes up. And then you take 5-minute break, kind of stretch your legs, walk around, grab something to eat, go to the bathroom, et cetera, and then sit back down for another 25 minutes. So that helps to keep you kind of focused for that period, but also gives you a break. And then, like we said, kind of building in review time or catch up time so that you can like get caught up if you get behind on any of and we're going to kind of talk about like specifics of what you should be doing with your time, but this is kind of broad strokes ideas. And then, make sure you think about what's really working well for your own individual studying. So what kind of resources and tools and techniques can you employ to help yourself be successful? And so some of those things, like I had mentioned, a digital calendar. So there's like free apps on your phone or your iPad that you can download that can allow you to build in and make a schedule. You can also use just like the Google Calendar app if you want to kind of have it overlap or overlay with other personal events or things you have going on. You can use a Google Calendar app that might be coming in. You might have something coming in from your email or whatever that automatically populates on the calendar to help you stay oriented. As far as studying apps go, I think everybody's probably heard of Anki, but there's also Quizlet and Notability. And so Anki is an excellent tool. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about flashcards, but if you like using electronic flashcards, we highly recommend some type of flashcard in your studying because I think it's really important to have spaced repetition happening early and often to help you to kind of re-emphasize the important tidbits of information that are going to show up on not only your individual block exams, but also for USMLE. So Quizlet's another option as well. And then Notability is a really excellent note-taking application that I personally recommend. I used it in medical school myself. It works really well on an iPad and you can download your class notes. And then you can use all sorts of like, you can use like your iPad pen or you can use a Microsoft to kind of write on your notes, which can be really useful and just kind of annotate things and have everything in an electronic format that then you have to review later. So, okay. And then as far as maximizing study efficiency, think this is my last slide, I promise, guys. Thank you for sticking with us. As far as maximizing study efficiency goes, there are a couple of things that we really want to emphasize tonight. So one is you kind of need to have all of your studying be a balance of these different resources that are going to kind of force you to study in different ways. So one, the most important form of studying that you can use is something called active learning. And that's really where you are being forced to actively participate instead of just watching a video or listening to a lecture. And you're really forcing yourself to think through the material. And so that can be in the form of using any type of flashcard, like using Anki, or using a paper flashcard if you prefer to write them out, where you're forcing yourself to think about and actively recall a fact. And then practice questions. Practice questions are kind of the highest level of active learning, because those are going to be your opportunity to think, on a second, third, quaternary level, as a question's asking you, not only to assume what the correct diagnosis is, but then also make a plan for treatment, those types of things that you'll see in UWorld or any other question bank. And so practice questions are really forcing you to use all of the connections in your brain between the material to come up at or arrive at the correct answer, the correct treatment for a patient. And so instead of you sitting there and listening to somebody talk during your lecture, you're really being forced to work with and manipulate the information in your brain and in the vignette to arrive at the correct answer. I think that it's super important when it comes to resources that you do not let yourself get overloaded with resources this year. It is really easy to start listening to all of your colleagues talk about this resource and that resource and what's working for them and what's not. And before you know it, you have like 7 or 8 resources you've paid for and you don't know which one of them to use when. So my recommendation, I'll let Christina speak to this too, would be to pick 3 or 4 resources that work well for you and stick with those throughout this year. And so, you have all of these to choose from, and this is just like a small smattering of resources to choose from, but these are kind of the bigger ones that we think about. So UWorld, I highly recommend that everybody use UWorld. It is definitely the gold standard as far as preparing for any USMLE exam. And so UWorld subscription is well worth the money. And if you can afford to do a year-long subscription, it's a really excellent tool to kind of complement your studying throughout the year as well, and getting used to the style of USMLE questions as you build towards your USMLE exam in the spring. Additionally, Pathoma is really excellent pathology resource. It is videos, so it's not quite as active learning, but the pictures and the descriptions and kind of the videos in terms of the length of them make it really easy to use it as a high yield resource review, especially throughout the year and then right before your USMLE as well. Boards and Beyond is another great video resource if you like listening to videos intermittently, but again, it shouldn't be a supplement for any sort of question-based resource. Amboss is also excellent, and so is Sketchy Medical as far as pharmacology and microbiology goes. And so I think those are kind of the core resources, but there's other things you might consider too. Like if you want a second question bank, I would probably recommend sticking with UWorld and Amboss, but there is, first aid for step 1. And then there's also USMLE RX, which is the first aid question bank that kind of pairs with first aid. And so if you're wanting to start on kind of I would say it's a less detailed question bank in terms of the questions aren't quite as difficult, but it can be a really great review because they will direct you straight to a page in first aid that each question is kind of built off of. And so that can be a great like early review if you want to try to save UWorld for later in the year. And then as far as study strategies, like try to switch things up throughout the year. Like I think it's super important to maintain your friendships. And so go to like focused study sessions or group study sessions because you'll learn something from your peers. And you'll also like, if things aren't working, you don't feel like you're studying in a really meaningful way, you're not being as productive as you want. Spending some time with some of your peers can help to motivate you. And you might also get something from them like, oh, this is what's working well for me. But if you have a good strategy that's working well for you, I would also say try to avoid any of the chatter of your peers throughout the year because you can get easily derailed. And you really, at this point, you guys have all made it to this point in your education on your own, right? So clearly you're doing something right and you know how to be productive and how to study. You might not want to do it, but you know how to do it because you've gone through, undergrad and gotten to this point in medical school. And so trust your own instincts in terms of what you know works for you. If you're more of an audiovisual person, if you're more of like you like to write out flashcards, you can't just type them out in Anki, whatever it is, trust your gut on that. And then regularly track your progress and kind of readjust your plan according to how things are going. All right, Christina, tapping
Awesome.
it.
Thank you so much, Emily. So I just wanted to like echo / touch on a few things Emily said before I go through this kind of pyramid, which is just that I wholeheartedly agree with the resource overload that happens and the chaos and chit chatter of, different people. And I personally think, UWorld, AMBOSS, question-based studying, I totally agree. Active recall is really important. I will say pathoma to this day, I know the coagulation cascade from pathoma clinically. And I use this sometimes when I'm teaching, med students, or we're talking about like, we use a lot of, different anticoagulants, antiplatelets in neurology. So definitely like would recommend looking into these resources, but keeping them narrow. And then the other thing I'll say is that I think you learn a lot from trying to explain a concept to someone else. Like you will realize deficits in your knowledge when you are put in a position where you have to kind of like explain in somewhat granular detail to someone else. So when I was in medical school using study groups, we would, go through things together and each person would kind of teach to the rest of the group. And it was both very fun and I'm still friends with those people, but also kind of was just another way of like active recall and consolidation. So I think like when you guys are in school, I know that, sometimes there's a lot of pressure to focus and buckle down, but I do think that there's a place for these kind of study sessions. And so kind of going over all of the resources, we touched on this a bit, but essentially like the pyramid of, ideal resource utilization is really what is the most active recall. And they've studied this, like they've done, studies of people and given them material to learn. And the ones who are able to more effectively consolidate the information are those who have been actively recalling the information, meaning that they do not have it, they're forced to retrieve it. It's that like active retrieval of information that helps you consolidate. So you want to be doing that. They can be like UWorld, AMBOSS questions. It can also be questions you write for yourself. Doesn't have to be via Anki. It can be a Word document where you write questions and have like an answer key, whatever you want, but you need to be recalling these things often. And the reason we just like Anki is because it does a little bit of the work for you in terms of appropriately distributing concepts based on your familiarity and expertise. So as you guys may know, Anki does a really good job of anytime you have a card, you basically rate your confidence in your answer for that card. Is it good? Is it medium? Is it bad? And then based on that, if it's a concept that you feel less comfortable with, it'll bring that card up more frequently. And if it's something you feel quite comfortable with, you will not see it again, which is exactly how you want to learn, right? You want to spend your time on things that you are not as familiar with and less time on things that you know well. And so that's why we are always really big proponents of the flashcards in addition to the practice questions that you'll use throughout, frankly, your entire career, because you will continue to take board exams and all of these sorts of things in training exams, unfortunately, as you go on. Visual memory aids I find very useful. That's another thing that I think is funny in residency. I still have knowledge based on, like little pictures from Sketchy, mostly like the antibiotics. And so it really is helpful. So I would check out Sketchy, and I totally agree. I think the microbiology and pharmacology questions or like the videos are the ones that are going to be the most useful. There's also ones for pathophysiology, but I don't think that they're as high yield as the micro ones because they help you consolidate sort of like nonsensical knowledge. So that's really helpful. But anything else, there's little like, I know there's cartoons and other websites to kind of memorize things. And then videos, like we said, Boards and Beyond are excellent as well. But again, less active, and finally reading being the most passive. And I mean, even when I studied for step 1, used a lot of like videos because I felt like just sitting and reading a book was kind of not active enough for me. So just keep this in mind as you guys go through your year, because these are principles that will carry on through the rest of your career. So in terms of how to approach complex subjects, I think we talked a little bit about this, but really like kind of making things simple and organized is really key. So like anytime I have a topic I'm trying to tackle in my head, I try and come up with like an organizational framework from which to approach it. So, for example, anemia, like you can break it down lots of different ways. You can do like microcytic, normocytic, macrocytic, or you could break it down into like hemolytic, non-hemolytic. There's lots of different ways to look at it. But having that organizational framework helps you kind of file things into appropriate categories. And then in the future too, when you're making a differential, having that organizational framework will help you more easily go through everything on your differential, make sure you're not missing anything. So splitting things up into groups, kind of keeping them clear in your head and then going bit by bit is really important. And then, as I mentioned before, I just cannot overstate how helpful Sketchy is, specifically for things like pharmacology. Like this is one of the anticholinergic ones. I still remember it. That's listed on our slide. And so you just want to go ahead and come up with whatever tools you can, especially for stuff that is less pathophysiology based and things that you can't reason your way through. I think another thing that's helpful, a lot of this is a little bit more in preclinical land than when you go to more of the pathophysiology, but drawing flowcharts and kind of pictograms and these sorts of things and trying to map things out is really helpful. And the picture they show on the bottom right is, again, kind of like coming up with an organizational framework for the information that you are given and coming up with an approach to kind of think about it logically. And that's going to help you retrieve that information later if you have it organized in like a straightforward way in your head. And then, of course, for any complex subject, like practice, 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 right? Whatever resource your school gives you, if they gave you practice questions at the end of each, lecture, if you have UWorld, whatever you have, use those things too. And then this is really important and perhaps understated in med school, at least when I was in med school, is that you need to take care of yourself. And Emily mentioned a little bit earlier, making time for the things that make you joyful and happy. And I could not agree more. And it will be even more important when you're in residency and are put in like an even more time stressed situation, and having the skills and the organizational capability to like keep yourself well is really important. And so I think the first thing is to kind of be mindful of the things that make you really happy, the things that charge you up and the things that deplete you, and making sure those things are somewhat balanced. I don't totally believe that in a lot of your training you will have the perfect balance that a lot of people speak of, but you're going to go through kind of ebbs and flows, and you want to know how you can kind of like realize when you're in a tough spot and how do I recover? How do I take the moments that I'm given and recharge? And so for some people, it's exercise. For some people, it's cooking. Some people, it's reading. Some people want to go out. Others want to stay home, figure out what that is, and try and make sure that you are maintaining that. And the same goes for mental health. A lot of people will do therapy and other things like that to help them cope with what is objectively a stressful and challenging time in your life. And that's just school, not including, right, the tides of life that come with it. And so taking note of the things that are helpful for that is really good. And I know a lot of people strongly benefit from just exercise every day, getting enough sleep every day. I know in medical school, sometimes the sleep thing, you're on rotations and things like that, that may impair it. But for preclinical, you should have that time. So try and, make the most of it. And then I think it's really important just to talk to your peers, because you may feel at times really overwhelmed, perhaps a little bit alone in this, but in reality, like there's so many people going through exactly what you're going through. And it can be really kind of uplifting to talk to your peers about the way you're feeling when you're having a tough go of it, or even not, just to kind of feel like the community of your class, because you really are all in it together. And then I think it's really important to talk about mentorship. So I didn't realize until I was applying to residency the profound impact of your mentors on your career. I mean, truly, I had no idea, but they made a huge, huge impact on my ability to go where I wanted to go, just because some of the people I worked with knew like a lot of the people in the field, and depending the field you're going into, it can be quite small. So it's really important to start early and try and make those connections. I think that there's lots of ways to do it. Emily talked a little bit earlier about shadowing over the summer or in the fall and trying to get a sense of what you want to do. getting the ball rolling with research is really helpful. I know for me personally, it was my research mentor that was like the most helpful, but I also had plenty of other mentors, clinical mentors, education mentors, lots of people I went to ask questions and to get their advice, and they were extremely helpful. So reach out to those people. And to be honest, you may have to reach out to a few people. You may send an email to someone, they may be too busy, it's some attending, they have already a couple fellows and a resident working with them, but don't give up. For me, it took me a couple tries to really land like a research job with somebody who I felt was a great mentor. And I talked with a lot of people about who in the department was a good mentor, who has had success with trainees. And that was really beneficial to me. And the person I ended up like working with has been really wonderful. And then you also want to connect with peers in your position. So usually there's like an interest group for any given specialty or areas of interest like community service. So try and find those groups as well and kind of put yourself in a space where you're around people who have similar interests to you and can kind of like broaden your horizons into what is available in medicine. And then of course, you know, you want to be respectful, professional, like this is the start of your career, which you will hopefully do for the rest of your life. And so you want to have this kind of like wide network of people and community. And this is really where you start to build it. And then in terms of research, so again, like I want to caveat this by saying that like you do not have to do research. It's just a way to show your interest, to explore and learn more about medicine and your chosen specialty. There are plenty of people who match really competitive specialties who are not big research people. However, I do think it's a really good exercise to do a small project. You just learn about the scientific process, you learn about research design, you learn about statistical analysis, how to interpret things, how to apply your conclusions to, you know, the population in question and your patients. Because at the end of the day, in your day-to-day practice, you're like extrapolating research onto the people in front of you. And so getting involved is helpful, even if you don't want to have a lab or anything like that one day. And so really just think about the things that you are excited about. Is there anything that you would listen to a podcast about, even if you didn't have to, or, you know, the type of books? If you pick up, you know, for me, like my whole life, I was like really interested in like neuroscience stuff and then like network stuff and epilepsy. And I kind of was interested in all of that stuff. And that's why I did that research in med school. So kind of figure out what that is that gets you excited, that you might read a paper about just for fun, and try and find those people and those labs. And then you want to kind of go ahead and find people who are doing that work. Your school probably has either a faculty mentor already assigned to you or people in the division that you can just ask that are somewhat like student facing. I think really good people to reach out to are like clerkship directors of the different clerkships that are like, I should say like content directors of the different contents that you're going through in your preclinical. So like there will be somebody who will give you the cardiology lectures, right? So if you're interested in cardiology, reach out to that person who gave you that lecture and say like, hey, you know, I'm really interested in this. Same goes for the person who gives you your GI lecture, whatever it is. And maybe they're not doing research, but they might know someone who is. And you want somebody who's active in research. And basically what that means is that they're actively publishing. So you want to go look at their publication record, see, are they putting out papers recently? If they're not, they might not be a good research mentor right now because they might not be actively working on anything. And so you want to look at that as well. And then just talk to people. There are plenty of people who I talked to when I was in medical school who said, oh, you know, like this person's really great. They were really helpful to me. They were really available and you should work with them. And that, you know, turned out to be true. And then when you think about reaching out to these people, so I strongly recommend if you are trying to get a research kind of gig with somebody in med school, read their papers and know a little bit about what they do when you send that email. They will be so impressed if you're able to comment on a couple of the studies that they did. And you can just come up with like a really quick email saying like, hi, I'm an MS2. You know, I read through some of your papers on X and Y and Z. I was really interested in so-and-so. I would love a chance to meet and like attach your CV. And a lot of them will take you up on that. And then if you do get that opportunity, you should kind of have an idea of what you want to get out of that meeting. And this honestly goes for any meeting that you have, really. You want to know what you want to get out of it. And so for this, you may want to be familiar with the research, ask them about what they're working on in the lab, come up with maybe even a couple of ideas of studies you'd be interested in doing. Sometimes attendings will have databases from which they publish research, and you can just look at different variables in that database that's already available. And that's a really great and kind of low-hanging fruit project. So just have an idea of what you want to do and have somewhat of a pitch of where you see yourself, even in broad strokes. I want to do something more medical, more surgical, what have you. And that will kind of help you be your best self when you're in this situation. And then in terms of kind of like where to start, it really just depends on your research experience. So some people have a master's, they're really confident with stats, they've done their own studies before and can kind of launch into things. I think most people are not that way. And so you want to go ahead, and I would say like the first entry level step is really just like attaching yourself to a project that's already ongoing. Usually it's a resident, they're already working on it, they've already started getting the ball rolling. You can help with the literature review, you can help with some of the stats, you can help, make the tables or like write some of the methods section of their abstract, little things like that to build up your familiarity. And then eventually you can tackle something on your own, just so that you don't kind of get in over your head out the get-go. A lot of these studies, if you design them wrong at the start, like they will continue, right, to not be of the highest caliber. And so you want to be able to have a really good understanding of like research design and how to start a project before you get too far into it.
Awesome. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything that you were saying, Christina. And I think, the other tool that you can use too, in addition to your content directors for each of your blocks throughout this year, is going to be like peers above you in medical school as well, who maybe are pursuing different specialties that are of interest to you. Ask those people, use the people around you to figure out, where there is research that's happening, who's a good research mentor to work with, who's publishing and who's not, because a lot of that, you can definitely find that out from just looking up the publication record of the mentor that you're considering trying to work with. But you can also get a lot of insight from the people above you. And so I think that's a really great resource to use too. Do not hesitate to ask the people around you for help and for questions. They've been through it before, and they're going to have the best kind of insider info. So I think that's kind of all the content we had planned for tonight. So we'd love to answer any specific questions that you guys have about this year whatsoever. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, but for those of you who aren't familiar with Elite Medical Prep, we are a USMLE and also NBME MCAT tutoring company that specializes really in one-on-one tutoring to help supplement and kind of teach topics to students in a way that's different than what you're getting in your day-to-day at your medical school training. And so we also offer some small group tutoring as well. And we offer free consultations. If you're interested in looking at tutoring whatsoever, it can be a really great resource to supplement all of your own studying. Please ask us any questions that you guys have. I guess I can start by just kind of asking Christina some questions as well, and we can go back and forth. I think one popular question that we get from a lot of second years is, when do I start using UWorld? Like, should I start doing it now? I don't feel like I know enough. What are your thoughts on that, Christina? How do you think students should be using the question banks throughout the year?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot, frankly, on what the structure of your medical school is. Like, for example, my medical school was a 1.5 year preclinical. And so we didn't really use UWorld until our kind of like 1.5 year when we entered clinical clerkships. But I do know that a lot of schools will do a full 2 years of preclinical before going on to clerkships. And there are also some medical schools now who only do a single year of preclinical, like UMich, and then go immediately into them. I really liked using UWorld for Step 2 CK when I was on my clinical clerkships and kind of going through all of that. I didn't do UWorld for Step 1 when I was on the preclinical side, just because we weren't going to take it Step 1 until after our clinical rotations. And so it kind of really depends from my perspective on like the infrastructure of your school, I would say that if you are taking step one at the end of your second year, then it may make sense to start doing those questions earlier. But if you're not going to take it until after your clinical rotations, which I know is like very popular in a lot of schools, then it usually doesn't make sense to be doing those kind of before you're doing all of your clinical rotations, when you're going to kind of like lose that knowledge you gained. But I don't know, I feel like perhaps your medical school was set up a little differently. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, 100%. So my medical school experience was at Indiana University. We did a full 2 years of preclinical. They've since gone to 18 months. And so I typically recommend that students get started on UWorld at the beginning of second year. If, like you're saying, you plan to take your USMLE Step 1 exam in the spring, essentially, of kind of your second year of being enrolled in medical school. I think it can be really useful, one, just to get kind of accustomed to how questions are going to show up. But I recommend students use UWorld for the year if you're going to be taking USMLE Step 1 again in the spring or the summer of your second year effectively. And start by doing your questions all on tutor mode, and do them according to the content that you're currently working through in each of your blocks throughout the year. So if you're doing cardiology, then do cardiology specific questions. And try to get through the bulk of the cardiology questions throughout your block, and that will help you to prepare for your individual school exam. And it also helps to get you kind of accustomed to USMLE style questions. And so that's typically what I have my students do for that. But again, I completely agree with you. If you're not going to take USMLE Step 1 until after you finish your clinical clerkships, then it probably doesn't necessarily make sense to do that, because you would end up needing to have a UWorld subscription for like 2 years for USMLE, the Step 1 Q bank. But I think if you're going to be taking it at the end of this year, I would recommend, and I think we just got this question from Hatham, how long should I subscribe for UWorld? I typically recommend doing the 1 year Q bank so that you have the opportunity to reset the question bank. Because typically what I have my students do is do the topic or content specific questions throughout the year with each of your blocks through your school. And then right before you're dedicated, you can reset your Q bank and kind of start doing all of the questions mixed, and start seeing all of the content kind of mixed together, right? Because there's a lot of times that you guys may know, if for those of you who have familiarity with UWorld up to this point, or any question bank, if you're doing pulmonology specific questions, like sometimes you come across a question where there's only one answer that has to do with pulm and the other 4 answers have to do with renal or cardiovascular or whatever. And so you kind of know automatically, oh, the right answer is going to be this one, right? And so I typically, for the dedicated period, will have, especially depending on how much time you have prepping for your Step 1 exam, I typically have students kind of reset and then do everything mixed so that you're really testing yourself at that point.
I do see a question in here just about our specialties, I guess, because someone missed them. So I'm in neurology, and then Emily's spine surgeries, but from ortho, right?
Yeah, from orthopedic surgery.
I guess if we don't have any other questions, the question I had for you, Emily, is really just about like what, we talked a little bit about research, and research is like the automatic reflex of every medical student who enters residency. But can you talk a little bit about like kind of in general what residencies are looking for, and like what you should be doing during your second year to kind of like start to prepare yourself for that process and kind of like get the ball rolling in ways to differentiate yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think depending on it doesn't really matter what specialty you end up going into. I do think that your point earlier, Christina, about like, doing something in research, it doesn't even matter if you get involved in plastic surgery research and then you up and decide like, I don't want to do that. I want to do dermatology. Like, any research that you end up doing will be helpful as you get ready to apply for residency, because it just shows initiative on your part. It also can demonstrate a lot of follow through. So if you're able to get involved in a project and see it through to completion and publish it, regardless of what it is, that kind of goes to show the program directors, like, this person has probably good time management skills. they're eager, they take initiative, they're, curious and like to learn, they're interested in these topics. And so it doesn't really matter, like ultimately, you don't need to wait around and say like, oh, I don't know what I want to do. And I want to wait to find a research project because I don't know for sure what specialty I'm going to apply to. But I think as far as differentiating yourself, there's a lot of different avenues to do that. And what I would say is that there's no one complete, like one perfect recipe for success. And the biggest thing is finding a couple of things that really interest you, that you're passionate about, and kind of sticking with those things throughout the rest of your medical school career. And like, if you may like decide you're going to go, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like something you might do. You might go like get really involved with a student outreach clinic if there's a student outreach clinic where you're in school. And maybe that just doesn't end up being a real passion of yours. Like, it's okay to pivot and stop doing that and do something else. But I think having a longitudinal involvement, so that you can really like, those are the things that you can bring up in your eventual interviews and residency and say like, oh, this is something I was really passionate about. And you can talk really knowledgeably about it. That just shows your future program directors like, oh, this person like has a lot of interests outside of medicine and they know how to balance their time. Again, it all comes down to like time management and leadership and like taking initiative, which are all really great qualities to have in a resident, regardless of what your specialty is. Because time management, like we said, is key. It starts out here in medical school and it will continue on. And even like once you get into practice, like figuring out how you're going to balance your schedule, how you're going to care for patients and take care of yourself, like those are good skills to build on. And so by getting involved in extracurriculars of some kind, you can really demonstrate your ability to do that and also still be successful in school. And so I would say find a couple of things that interest you and kind of try them out this year, and then find one or two things that you really enjoy doing and stick with it. And that may be like seeking out a leadership role in a special interest group. If you're interested in orthopedic surgery or you're interested in neurology, you might find yourself kind of planning events for those special interest groups. That can be one way to differentiate yourself. Getting involved with research, and then getting involved with like some sort of volunteerism, whether that's like, doing something like Big Brothers Big Sisters where you're at, participating in a student outreach clinic, volunteering your time, at the hospital. If there's a volunteer position you can get, those types of things that really show your passion for medicine, can be really helpful to differentiate yourself. Was there anything else that you did during medical school, Christina, or you've had students do that set them apart?
No, I totally agree. I think that the thing that was most helpful for me is just like, because you're spread so thin, is really kind of figuring out the things that like you're excited to do. So like for me, I was really involved, and I think you were too, in like our school's free clinic. And that was like a thing for me that I loved, and it was like inspiring. And so even if I was tired, whatever, I like was really passionate about it. And then it also comes through like when you're interviewing. So yeah, I totally agree. And like, you don't need to go crazy, just like one or two things.
Yeah. Kind of pivoting back, and again, guys, keep putting your questions in. I did see a question in the chat from Hatham about getting in touch with us to work on a research or case report. I don't have any active research going on right now. I've only been at the Cleveland Clinic for 6 weeks, so I don't have much to, and I don't know honestly if I'm going to do a research project this year. But I don't know, Christina. I would recommend like trying to get in touch with people at your institution, because the trouble with doing certain research projects across institutions is that you often aren't able to get credentialed from like a HIPAA perspective to access patient charts, if you're not currently a student at the institution associated with that hospital. And so there can be a kind of a lot of like red tape in that regard, to get involved. And so unfortunately, I can't offer you any research projects here for that reason either. And also I don't have any ongoing, but I would recommend reaching out to, again, some of your peers at your program, or just finding somebody, a potential mentor in a department. The other resource you can use is like, sometimes if there is a special interest group, like I know we're at one of the medical schools, one of my students has gone to, they had like a special interest group that would send out emails about resident research projects. and things like that were ongoing that they needed medical student support for. And so going via the avenue of a special interest group for the specialty you're interested in, again, whether that's orthopedic surgery, some sort of gastroenterology, whatever, medicine, internal medicine, cardiology, like there's all these different special interest groups at a lot of medical schools, and they can be a great resource for getting involved with a project.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think for the same reason, like even, I even have like medical student mentees in Philly, the same city as I am, and I've tried to get them to literally just shadow me like at Penn, and it has not been possible. So like the like barriers from an institutional standpoint are like so unbelievably high that like doing like cross institution collaborations on a project is like very hard unless you have like a PI, like a research leader at multiple sites and they're all on the same IRB. If that's the case, you can do it, but without that, it's really hard. So I don't think it would be like the best use of your time. That could take, like years. But I do think just like finding people in your department is really great. Sometimes it's also helpful, like if you have the opportunity to go to a conference in your field, that's like subsidized. Sometimes schools will subsidize like one trip a year. You can apply for funding and then you can go and kind of like look at a bunch of abstracts from people, see what's going on. And sometimes people are taking on, especially medical students, like if you end up taking a research year or something like that, maybe that's where you find that position. So it is, worthwhile. That's like another way to network and get to know more about what's going on in the field.
For sure. So one question I wanted to ask you too is about flashcards and Anki. So what are your thoughts on students making their own flashcards if they're using Anki, or they're writing them out, or they're making a Word document, like you had said, kind of asking themselves questions and leaving an answer, versus using a pre-made flashcard deck in Anki? What are your thoughts on that? How do you usually counsel your students?
Yeah, I have pretty strong thoughts. I'll also just like caveat this for everyone in that I was very anti-flashcard when I started medical school, and I was like a person who wrote everything out in these beautiful diagrams, and I had to like wholeheartedly abandon it because it just like was inefficient, and I fully converted to flashcards after like a hard fight against them for my first 6 months of MS1. And so I now have come to really like them. And I think the thing that I always tell people is that the flashcard is efficient because it is focusing on what you don't know and like refining what you don't know and not focusing on what you do know. And so I don't really like pre-made decks, one, because they often have like excessive information and are like overly complex for learning. And then two, they're not specific to you and your like educational strengths and weaknesses. So I always tell people to make their own decks rather than using the pre-made ones for this kind of test prep stuff. And that way you can be really, first of all, you can make better cards that are like succinct, simple, to the point, and will optimize your learning, but also cards that are focused on your areas of weakness so that you can like be giving yourself kind of like the most tailored study experience. So that's what I would say. I don't know. Did you ever use the pre-made ones?
No, 100%. Completely agree. I admittedly, similar to you, I did not use Anki during most of my medical school, actually, but I was always doing flashcards. But I would write out flashcards. And I think I completely agree with what you said, Christina. And if there's one thing I can emphasize to you guys on this webinar tonight, it's that, one, like limit your resources, and two, be really intentional about trying to fill in your knowledge gaps wherever they are. And I think that can be best achieved by really drilling down on the things you don't know. And like Christina said, it's hard to get that from a pre-made flashcard deck that's just like somebody has arbitrarily said that these are the things you need to know. And you may already know some of them, and the other ones, the things that you really need to buff up on, are not popping up. And so, and I also think the trouble with pre-made decks is that there's a lot of cards, and that can be really overwhelming and daunting to students to try to figure out how to get through all of those cards. Whereas if you're making your own flashcards, whether you're writing them out or you're using Anki or Quizlet, you can be really intentional about identifying the gaps in your knowledge and really testing yourself on the things that you need to know that you struggle to remember. And so I personally completely agree with what you said. Some other tools that I use or I've recommended to students, if you don't like using electronic flashcards, is, one, you can buy just like colored flashcards, and you can kind of color code things and make it interesting to you that way. Like a lot of the stores like Office Depot or whatever, Staples, you can buy different color flashcards. And so you can have pink flashcards that are your pharmacology flashcards, and then you can have other flashcards, colors that are your microbiology flashcards and what have you. You can kind of work that way. You can also use Post-it notes. So I actually did this for a period, and I recommend this to students sometimes who struggle with electronic flashcards. I had a wall of like Post-it notes, and I color coded them. Like blue, I think, was pathophysiology concepts, and like green was microbiology, and I had them on one wall. And then I would kind of just test myself daily and move. If I knew them, I would move it to a different area on the wall. And if I couldn't remember it, I would keep it on the wall. And so every day I would kind of just look at the Post-it notes and then move them. My room probably looked like something out of like, I don't know, like The Shining or some like crazy movie, because it was just like chaos everywhere. But that was something that it was kind of fun for me and made it more interactive. I wasn't just staring at a computer screen. And so I think that's another option too, but completely agree. All right, we got another question. How do you plan your day if you're planning to take step 1 in 6 months? What do you think, Christina?
Yeah. I mean, I think some questions that I have are like, what else is going on in these 6 months? Like, are you also in classes? Are you on a research year? Like, what's going on? Because I think like I say for standard step 1 preparation usually requires 6 weeks of studying about 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day. I see light research. Okay, so you have a lot of time. So yeah, so like our standard approach and like what I did when I was in medical school is I did like full-time studying for 6 weeks, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and then took the test. And that was more than adequate for that period of time. And I had not ever been through the step 1 Q bank prior to that time. I think if you have 6 months, you can kind of spread it out a little bit more, but I think the questions become like, what resources do you want to use? And so from my perspective for step 1, I always recommend UWorld. I always recommend Anki. I always recommend Pathoma. I always recommend Sketchy. I don't know that you need Boards and Beyond videos on top of that if you're also like going to the primary source of first aid, but they could be supplementary. And I would probably recommend just kind of like splitting up the questions with a goal of getting through the Q bank twice. And you can certainly do that in that period of time and then just spread them out and figure out like how many questions per day you need to do. And same goes with like Sketchy, Pathoma, all of the other content that you'd want to go through like at least once. And I think for Sketchy and Pathoma, like ideally twice if you have the time. I don't know, Emily, if you have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And I think to the follow-up question that you asked them is like, how do you spread the time between Boards and Beyond videos in UWorld? And I think this is one thing I had meant to mention earlier, so I'm glad you brought it up. Like, as far as active learning goes, it's best to prioritize doing questions and flashcards, engaging in the active learning types of activities when you're kind of at your peak concentration and focus. And so sometimes, depending on what the demands are of your medical school education, your classes, your lectures, you may not be able, if you like wake up and you kind of like get your cup of coffee and that might really be your peak time to focus, but you might not be able to do questions during that time if you have to go to lecture. So I think throughout the year, depending on what else you have going on, it's just really important to prioritize active learning earlier in the day when you're most alert and most able to focus. So I typically recommend, like if you say you have lectures in the morning, and I know this isn't your exact situation, Hatham, but for some of the other people on the call, if you have lectures in the morning, go to your lectures, participate, take good notes, take a break, and then do your questions in the early afternoon when you're still kind of awake. And then do, 20 to 40 questions, depending on what your schedule is, probably 20 throughout the year until you get to dedicated. If you're doing 20 UWorld questions a day, even 10 to 20, somewhere in that realm is probably a reasonable and achievable number of questions to try to get through. And usually I recommend, if you're doing a 40 question block, that typically should take you about 4 hours to do all the questions and review them. And like you shouldn't be spending probably more than 4 hours on 40 questions, in my personal opinion, because otherwise you're going to get too bogged down. And so for 20 questions, that should be about 2 hours of time to give you guys an idea of like how much time. If you need to add another 30 minutes because you want to spend time like writing something out or you're making flashcards in while you're going through your questions, okay, great. Yeah, add another 30 minutes, but kind of a ballpark for your knowledge. And then at the end of the day, when you're like getting sleepier and you're kind of like, just drained from studying, being at your lectures, whatever, you can start kind of doing less active things. So you do questions first, and then I recommend doing flashcards and spend like 30 minutes to an hour reviewing some flashcards. And then you can watch a video at night before you're about to go to bed, because that's going to be the least active thing. And, you're going to have a harder time focusing, but you can watch something if like you think, oh, I don't really remember like a lot about atrial fibrillation. I just kind of want to like rewatch a video, find appropriate Boards and Beyond video and watch that in the evening before you go to bed. So that's typically how I recommend that my students structure their day throughout the year leading up to dedicated. And that can kind of give you a good breakdown of how to get through things. I think we're getting close to 9. Do you guys have any other questions? I'm sure Christina and we've been asked plenty of questions. We could keep coming up with questions for each other, but we don't want to take up all your time tonight.
It looks like that's,
oh, sorry. One more question. Why does it take me 4 hours for 20 questions at most? Any advice on how to tackle? I actually have some, I'm sure Christina, you have some tips too. I'll just briefly say, I think when you're going through a question bank, the biggest thing I can advise to you right now is start doing all of your questions on tutor mode. So I know a lot of students, you want to use a question bank as a testing mechanism, but really it is a learning tool. And so you're learning by doing the question, answering it, and then getting immediate feedback. Were you right or wrong? And then beyond that, I think you need to be really honest with yourself. Like, did you just get it right because you guessed between two and you went 50-50 and you picked one and here we are? Or did you get it right because you really identified correctly what the content was that was being tested? You were able to think through the pathophysiology and you were able to arrive at the correct answer on your own. And so that's what you really need to be looking for in each explanation. And I think, early on, I would tell students like kind of skim the explanations, but sometimes you will get bogged down by reading an explanation to a question. And it's really easy to like get kind of in the weeds reading the exact explanation for why answers A, B, C, and D were wrong, but E was correct. And that will really suck up a lot of time. So if I can give you one piece of advice, what I would say is, 1, do your questions on tutor mode. Test yourself. If you're between 2 answer choices and you pick one and it's right, then read the explanation to ensure that you really understood correctly the pathophysiology that was being tested. Because sometimes you might get the right answer, but you totally misunderstood what the question was asking, but you kind of got lucky. So you just need to make sure that you read the explanation for the correct answer, and then read the explanation for any answers that you were between. So if you're between 2 answer choices, make sure you read the explanation for why the other answer choice was wrong, and then skip anything else. Like don't worry about the other answer choices that were wrong. If you weren't really considering them and you had already ruled them out, then don't bother like reading through those explanations, because it will become a time suck. And ultimately the thing you need to know is like UWorld has continued. I think they only had like 2,000 questions for step 1 when I was going through school, and I'm like a dinosaur at this point. And now they have way more questions. And so every single content piece that you need to know for your USMLE Step 1 exam is gonna show up in that question bank and be tested in its own unique way. So you do not need to like reread every single explanation choice. Focus on the correct answer explanation, any answer choice that you might have picked that was wrong, or you were thinking about picking that was wrong, and then make sure you just skim the educational objective at the bottom of UWorld so that you understand exactly why that question was in the Q bank, because there's always one specific point or factoid that they're trying to test you on that you need to know for the exam. And so if you just look at those 3 things and focus on those 3 things, I think you'll be able to speed up how much time you spend on questions.
I totally agree. I say basically the exact thing verbatim to the students that I teach. So could not agree more. And I think for the sake of time, we'll wrap it up there. But thank you guys so much. It was really lovely kind of getting some questions from you and chatting about this period in your life. It's really exciting. Now that you know a little bit about EMP, you're welcome to kind of chat with us. There's some information there on how to set up a consultation if you want to chat with us. And there's tons more webinars. We do webinars about how to prepare for every test, residency, you name it. We probably have some, informational webinars on it, so feel free to check those out.
I think you should be receiving a link to the recording as well, or the recording will be published too. So if you want to review anything else or whatnot, you'll have access to that too. Thanks so much for coming tonight, guys. All right.